When Catherine recognized her dead father's signature on the document in front of the city's most powerful billionaire, her mouth opened before her brain could stop it. Those 8 words would either expose a 15-year-old murder or cost her everything she had left. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Some moments arrive with the weight of destiny disguised as coincidence. For Catherine Walsh, a 31-year-old waitress at the prestigious Belmont Club, that moment came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening when she placed a contract in front of the most powerful man in the city and recognized the signature at the bottom. Not because it belonged to him, but because it belonged to someone she had loved and lost 15 years ago. Her father, the man seated before her, billionaire Marcus Aldridge, had no idea that the elegant cursive flourish he'd been copying for over a decade was about to unravel the carefully constructed empire he'd built on stolen identity and calculated lies. The Belmont Club sat on the 48th floor of the Meridian Tower, a cathedral of wealth where the city's elite gathered to conduct business that shaped markets and toppled competitors. Catherine had worked there for 3 years, long enough to become invisible to the men and women who wielded power like a birthright. She had learned to move through the dining room like a ghost, anticipating needs before they were spoken, reading the subtle cues of wealth and ego that dictated the rhythm of her nights. The tips were extraordinary, the work exhausting, but it paid the bills and allowed her to care for her younger brother Thomas, who was finishing his engineering degree at the State University. Tonight, the dining room hummed with its usual controlled chaos. Crystal chandeliers cast warm pools of light over tables draped in cream linen. The soft murmur of conversation blended with the delicate clink of silverware against bone china. Catherine moved between tables with practiced grace, her black uniform crisp, her dark hair pulled into an elegant knot at the base of her neck. She had just delivered appetizers to a table of hedge fund managers when Marcel, the Mater caught her eye and gestured toward the private dining room at the far end of the restaurant. The private room was reserved for the club's most important guests, and tonight it belonged to Marcus Aldridge. Catherine knew the name the way everyone in the city knew it. Aldridge Capital controlled billions in assets. Marcus Aldridge himself was a fixture in the business pages, a self-made billionaire who had risen from nothing to build one of the most successful investment firms on the East Coast. He was in his late 50s, distinguished-looking with silver hair and sharp features that spoke of discipline and focus. The business press loved his story, the orphan son of working-class parents who had clawed his way to the top through intelligence, determination, and an almost supernatural ability to identify undervalued companies before anyone else. Catherine entered the private dining room with a bottle of the club's finest Bordeaux, the kind that cost more than her monthly rent. Marcus Aldridge sat alone at the round table, his charcoal suit impeccable, his attention focused on a stack of documents spread before him. He didn't look up as she approached. This was typical. Men like Aldridge rarely acknowledged the staff. They existed in a different stratum of reality where service was expected and therefore unremarkable. She poured the wine with the quiet efficiency she'd perfected, the deep red liquid cascading into the crystal glass without a single drop spilled. As she set the bottle on the table, Aldridge spoke without lifting his eyes from the paper. His dinner would be the usual, he said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The filet mignon rare with the truffle risotto, and he needed to review one more contract before his associates arrived. Could she bring him better light? The ambient lighting was insufficient for detailed reading. Catherine murmured her acknowledgement and left to retrieve the portable reading lamp kept for such requests. When she returned, Aldridge had moved one of the contracts to the center of the table, his pen poised above the signature line. She positioned the lamp carefully, angling the light to eliminate shadows. As the bright illumination fell across the document, Catherine's breath caught in her throat. There at the bottom of the page, in the space marked for authorized signature, was a name she knew as well as her own, Thomas J. Walsh, her father's name. Her father, who had died 15 years ago in what the police had ruled an unfortunate accident, a fall from the observation deck of this very building when it was still under construction, back when it was nothing but steel beams and concrete floors and the promise of something grand. Thomas Walsh had been a senior architect with Morrison and Blake, the firm that had designed the Meridian Tower. He'd been 43 years old, brilliant, meticulous, and the kind of man who double-checked every calculation because lives depended on the integrity of his work. But that wasn't what froze Catherine in place. It was the signature itself, not just her father's name printed in neat block letters, but his actual signature, the one she had seen on birthday cards and school permission slips and the deed to their modest family home. The distinctive flourish of the capital T, the way the J in his middle initial looped back under the first name, the slight rightward slant of the letters that spoke of his left-handedness. She had spent countless hours as a teenager practicing that signature, trying to forge his name on notes excusing her from gym class, never quite capturing the effortless elegance of his hand. She knew every curve and line of it, and here it was, on a contract dated 6 months ago, 15 years after Thomas Walsh had been buried in Riverside Cemetery. Catherine's hands began to tremble. The room tilted slightly, and she gripped the back of Aldridge's chair to steady herself. The billionaire looked up, irritation flickering across his features. Was something wrong, he asked? his tone making it clear that nothing should be wrong, that any disruption to his evening was an unwelcome intrusion. Catherine's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Forgery was the obvious answer, but why would Marcus Aldridge, a man worth billions, need to forge a dead architect's signature on a contract, unless the contract itself was connected to something that required Thomas Walsh's authorization, something valuable enough to warrant the risk. Her father had been working on several high-profile projects when he died, but the details had been lost in the chaos of grief and financial ruin that followed his death. Her mother had been too devastated to pursue question, and Catherine had been too young to know what questions to ask. She realized Aldridge was staring at her, waiting for an answer. Without thinking, the words tumbled out of her mouth. "Excuse me, sir, but that signature, I'd recognize my father's signature anywhere. That's Thomas Walsh's signature. My father, he died 15 years ago." The effect on Marcus Aldridge was instantaneous and profound. The color drained from his face. His hand, which had been holding the pen with relaxed confidence, went rigid. For a moment he simply stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, fear, and something darker, something calculate. Then he carefully set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. He was assessing her, she realized, weighing whether she was a threat or merely an inconvenience. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, almost gentle, as though he were explaining something to a confused child. He was very sorry for her loss, he said. Thomas Walsh had indeed been a respected architect, but she must be mistaken about the signature. This was his signature, Marcus Aldridge's signature. He had been signing documents this way for 20 years. Perhaps the similarity was coincidental. Grief sometimes made people see connections that weren't there, but Catherine wasn't mistaken, and she wasn't confused. She had grown up watching her father sign documents at the kitchen table, had helped him organize his home office, had gone through his files after he died, trying to make sense of the paperwork her mother couldn't bear to touch. She knew his signature the way she knew her own reflection, and she knew what she was looking at. This wasn't coincidence. This was theft. Someone had taken her father's signature, his identity marker, the unique expression of his hand, and was using it as their own. The implications crashed over her like a wave. If Marcus Aldridge had been using her father's signature for 20 years, that meant he had been using it for 5 years before her father died, which meant either he had learned to perfectly mimic it through some bizarre coincidence, or he had deliberately copied it. And if he had copied it, the question was, why? What did a man who claimed to be self-made need with another man's signature? Unless he wasn't self-made at all. Unless everything about Marcus Aldridge was a carefully constructed lie. She looked at him sitting there in his expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face a mask of polite concern with an edge of warning underneath. He was waiting to see what she would do, whether she would accept his explanation and retreat back into her role as invisible staff, or whether she would push further and force him to take action. Catherine felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could walk away, serve his dinner, collect her tip, and pretend she had never seen the signature. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice. Men like Marcus Aldridge had the power to destroy people who threatened them, but she also felt something else rising within her, something that had been dormant for 15 years. The memory of her father's funeral, the closed casket because the fall had been so terrible, her mother's grief-stricken face, the way their lives had crumbled in the aftermath. The investigation had been cursory, an accident, they said. He had been working late, checking measurements on the observation deck, and had somehow fallen. No witnesses, no evidence of foul play, just a tragic accident. But Catherine had never quite believed. Her father had been obsessively careful, the kind of man who wore a harness and checked it twice. The kind of man who didn't fall. She met Aldridge's eyes, and in that moment she made a choice. She wouldn't walk away. Not from this. "I'm not mistaken," she said quietly. "That's my father's signature, and I want to know why you're using it." The air in the private dining room suddenly felt thin, charged with danger. Marcus Aldridge's expression hardened. The veneer of polite concern vanished, replaced by something cold and ruthless. He stood up slowly, his considerable height giving him an advantage. He suggested, in a tone that was less suggestion and more command, that she was overwrought and should perhaps take a break. He would speak to Marcel about having someone else attend to his tape. It would be best for everyone if she simply forgot this unfortunate confusion. But Catherine didn't move. She stood there, the reading lamp casting harsh shadows across the damning signature, and felt 15 years of unanswered questions crystallizing into a single terrible certainty. Her father hadn't died in an accident. He had died because of this man, because of whatever secret that signature represented. And if she walked away now, she would never know the truth. She would spend the rest of her life wondering, just as her mother had, just as her brother did, whether Thomas Walsh's death had been the random tragedy they'd been told or something far more sinister. Marcus Aldridge was watching her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Catherine realized she was standing at a crossroads. One path led to safety and ignorance. The other led into darkness and danger, but also toward truth. She thought of her father, of the way he used to check her math homework with infinite patience, of his laugh, of the way he'd called her his little scholar and told her that the truth was always worth pursuing, no matter how difficult. She took took a breath and made her choice. The silence that followed Catherine's refusal to leave stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Marcus Aldridge's jaw tightened, and she saw a muscle twitch beneath his left eye. He was a man unaccustomed to defiance, especially from someone he considered so far beneath him that she barely registered as human. The staff at the Belmont Club were meant to be extensions of the furniture, present when needed, invisible when not. Catherine had just violated the fundamental rule of her existence in his world by asserting that she mattered, that what she knew mattered, and that he couldn't simply dismiss her with a wave of his hand. He reached for his phone, his movements deliberate and controlled. Catherine knew what was coming. He would call Marcel, complain about the disturbed waitress who was harassing him, and she would be escorted out of the building and fired before she could finish her shift. By tomorrow morning, her name would be quietly circulated among the other exclusive establishments in the city, and she would be unemployable in any venue that catered to the wealth. It was how power worked in this world. Absolute and crushing and utterly indifferent to justice. But before Aldridge could complete the call, Catherine did something that surprised even herself. She pulled out her own phone, an old model with a cracked screen that had somehow survived 3 years of double shifts and endless nights, and held it up. "I took a picture of the signature," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "and I'm going to send it to someone who can verify it. Unless you'd like to explain to me right now why you're using a dead man's signature on legal documents." It was a bluff. She hadn't taken any pictures, but the threat was enough. Aldridge froze, his thumb hovering over his phone screen. She watched him recalculate, saw the cold intelligence behind his eyes processing this new variable. He was deciding whether she was credible, whether she actually had evidence, and more importantly, what the cost would be if that evidence became public. Catherine held her ground, hoping he couldn't hear the hammering of her heart or see the slight tremor in her hand. After what felt like an eternity, Aldridge slowly lowered his phone. He set it on the table with exaggerated care, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Perhaps," he said in a voice stripped of its earlier warmth, "we should have a conversation." "Sit down, Miss Walsh." "Yes, I know your last name. You think I don't pay attention to the people who serve me? I know everyone who works in this establishment. I make it my business to know." Catherine didn't believe him. He was improvising, trying to regain control of the situation by pretending he'd been aware of her identity all along. But she sat down anyway, perching on the edge of the chair, ready to bolt if necessary. The contract with her father's signature lay between them, an accusation neither could ignore. Up close, in the harsh light from the reading lamp, she could see the fine details even more clearly. The signature was perfect, too perfect. It wasn't just similar to her father's hand. It was identical, as though photocopied from an original and practiced until muscle memory could reproduce it flawlessly. Aldridge leaned back, steepling his fingers in a gesture that reminded Catherine of every movie villain she'd ever seen. He was performing now, she realized, slipping into a role he'd played before. The reasonable man, the patient, explicable, the person who would help her understand why her perception was flawed. "Your father," he began, "was a brilliant architect. I knew him professionally. We worked together on several projects before his untimely death. I was devastated when I heard about the accident. Thomas was a friend as well as a colleague." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Catherine almost believed it. Almost. But she had been 16 when her father died, and she remembered the aftermath with painful clarity. There'd been no billionaire friends at the no one from Marcus Aldridge's world had sent flowers or condolences. Her mother had struggled alone with the mortgage and the bills, eventually losing the house and moving them into a cramped apartment across town. If Marcus Aldridge had truly been her father's friend, he had been remarkably absent when the Walsh family needed friends most. She said as much, watching his reaction. Aldridge didn't flinch. Instead, he sighed, a world-weary sound that suggested he was burdened by knowledge he wished he didn't possess. "Thomas and I had a complicated relationship," he said. "We were partners in a venture that ultimately failed. It was kept quiet because we both had other professional obligations. When he died, I thought it best to maintain that discretion out of respect for his family. I didn't want to complicate your mother's grief by introducing questions about business dealings she knew nothing about." It sounded plausible. That was the terrifying thing. Marcus Aldridge was good at this, spinning a narrative that explained everything while revealing nothing. Catherine felt herself wavering, wondering if she had stumbled into something more complex than simple forgery. Perhaps her father had given permission for Aldridge to use his signature on certain documents. Perhaps there had been a partnership she'd never known about. Her father had sometimes been secretive about his work, coming home late and locked away in his study with blueprints and calculations. But then she looked at the date on the contract, 6 months ago, and the small doubt that had been growing in her mind crystallized into certainty. Even if there had been some arrangement between her father and Aldridge 15 years ago, that arrangement had died with Thomas Walsh. There was no legitimate reason for a signature to still be in use a decade and a half after the person who owned it had been buried. This wasn't about honoring a partnership or maintaining discretion. This was about something else entirely, something worth protecting with lies and intimidation. Catherine met Aldridge's eyes directly. "If you were partners," she said slowly, "then you'll have documentation. Contracts, correspondence, proof that my father authorized you to use his signature. I'd like to see it, all of it. And I'd like an explanation for why his signature appears on documents dated years after his death. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Aldridge's expression shifted from patient understanding to something harder, more dangerous. He had been giving her an out, a plausible story she could accept and walk away with her dignity intact. She had just rejected it, and in doing so, had forced him to acknowledge that she wasn't going to be easily managed. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that made her skin prickle with instinctive fear. "You're in over your head," he said quietly. "Your father made certain choices that had consequences. He was involved in things that, if they came to light, would destroy his reputation and devastate what's left of your family. I've been protecting his memory, protecting you and your mother and your brother from the truth. But if you insist on digging into the past, you need to understand that what you find might not be the heroic story you're imagining." It was a masterful deflection, Catherine realized with a cold fury. He was trying to turn her father into the villain of the story, to make her fear what she might discover enough that she would stop asking questions. The tactic might have worked if she hadn't spent 15 years living with the shadow of her father's death, watching her mother sink into depression and financial ruin, helping her brother through the trauma of losing the man who had been his hero and mentor. She knew Thomas Walsh. She knew his integrity, his obsessive honesty, the way he agonized over ethical questions most people would have brushed aside. Whatever Marcus Aldridge was about to accuse her father of, she knew it would be a lie, or at the very least a distortion of the truth so severe that it bore no resemblance to the man who had raised her. She leaned forward, her voice low and fierce. "My father was the most honest man I've ever known," she said. "He spent 6 months agonizing over whether to report a contractor who was using substandard materials because he didn't want people to lose their jobs. But he couldn't compromise on safety. He turned down a promotion because it would have required him to approve designs he thought were structurally unsound. Whatever you're about to tell me about him, I know it's a lie." Aldridge studied her for a long moment, and Catherine saw something shift in his expression. The mask of civility cracked, revealing a glimpse of the ruthless calculation underneath. He was done trying to manage her with kindness or threats. She had proven herself to be more resilient than he'd anticipated, and now he was moving to a different strategy. He stood up abruptly, gathering the contracts on the table and sliding them into a leather portfolio. "This conversation is over. You're clearly emotionally compromised and unable to perform your duties professionally. I'll be speaking to the management about having you removed from the premises. As for your accusations, they're baseless and potentially liable. I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next, Miss Walsh. Men in my position have resources you can't imagine. We have lawyers who specialize in destroying people who make false accusations. We have investigators who can dig into every aspect of your life and find things you didn't even know were there. And we have friends in places that matter. People who can make sure you never work in this city again." The threat was explicit now, stripped of all pretense. Catherine felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had crossed a line and there was no going back. Either she pressed forward and risked everything, or she retreated and spent the rest of her life wondering what truth she had been too afraid to pursue. She thought of her father falling from the 48th floor of this building, thought of the closed casket and the unanswered questions, and the way her mother had never quite recovered from the loss. She thought of her brother Thomas, named after the father he barely remembered, studying engineering because he wanted to honor a man whose work had been stolen and whose death had been dismissed as an accident. She stood up, meeting Aldridge's gaze without flinching. "Do what you need to do," she said, "but I'm not going to stop asking questions. My father deserves the truth, and so does my family. If you're innocent, then you have nothing to fear from an investigation. But if you're not, then you should know that I'm not going to let this go." For a moment, something flickered across Aldridge's face, an emotion Catherine couldn't quite read. It might have been respect or fear or simply cold calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by the impenetrable mask of a man who had spent decades hiding his true thoughts behind a facade of confidence and control. He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "Your father thought he could stand up to powerful people too," he said softly. "Look where it got him." Then he was gone, leaving Catherine alone in the private dining room with the reading lamp still casting its harsh light across the empty table. She stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand the full implications of Aldridge's parting words. They hadn't sounded like a warning. They had sounded like a confession, like an admission that Thomas Walsh's death hadn't been an accident at all, but rather the consequence of standing up to someone who had the power to make people disappear. Catherine's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone again, this time for real. She opened the camera app and photographed everything she could remember about the contract, though the document itself was gone. She photographed the table, the chair where Aldridge had been sitting, the room itself, as though the physical space could somehow preserve evidence of what had just transpired. Then she sat down heavily in the chair and tried to figure out what to do next. She had just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the city, a man who had essentially admitted to being involved in her father's death. She had no proof, no allies, and no idea how deep the conspiracy went. All she had was her certainty that the signature on that contract had been her father's, and her absolute conviction that Marcus Aldridge was not the self-made billionaire he pretended to be. He had stolen something from Thomas Walsh, something valuable enough to kill for, and he had been living off that theft for 15 years. The question was, What had he stolen? An architectural design? A business plan? Something else entirely? And how could she prove it without access to the documents Aldrich had just taken with her? Catherine's phone buzzed in her hand, making her jump. It was a text from Marcel. She was needed in his office immediately. The process of her destruction had already begun. Marcel's office was a small, windowless room tucked behind the kitchen, furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet that held personnel records dating back to the club's opening. Catherine had been in this room exactly twice before, once when she was hired and once when she received a commendation for her exceptional service during a difficult private event. She had never imagined she would be back here under these circumstances, but as she pushed open the door, she already knew what was coming. The only question was how brutal Marcel would make it. The maître d' sat behind his desk with his hands folded, his expression carefully neutral. Marcel Beaumont was a precise man in his early 60s who had spent his entire career in high-end hospitality. He'd been managing the Belmont Club since its opening 12 years ago, and he ran it with the efficiency of a military operation. Catherine had always respected him, appreciated his fairness and his willingness to stand up for his staff when guests became unreasonable. But she also knew that his loyalty had limits, and those limits ended where the club's most important patrons began. "Sit down, Catherine," he said quietly, and the use of her first name told her everything she needed to know. Marcel only used first names when delivering bad news. She sat, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same dignity her father had taught her. Marcel sighed, a sound heavy with regret that might even have been genuine. "Mr. Aldrich called me from the private dining room 10 minutes ago. He was very upset. He claims you made inappropriate comments about his personal business, that you harassed him about a signature on a private document, and that you became aggressive when he asked you to leave. He's demanding that you be terminated immediately, and that you be escorted from the building by security." Catherine had expected this, but hearing the words still hit her like a physical blow. She'd worked at the Belmont Club for 3 years, had built relationships with regular guests, had earned a reputation as one of the most reliable servers on staff. All of that was about to be erased because she had dared to question a billionaire. She took a breath and met Marcel's eyes. "Did he tell you what the signature was? Did he explain why I recognized it?" Marcel's expression flickered with something that might have been curiosity, but he shook his head. "Doesn't matter what the signature was, Catherine. You violated the fundamental rule of this establishment. Our guests' privacy is absolute. Whatever you saw, whatever you thought you saw, you should have kept it to yourself. The moment you confronted Mr. Aldrich, you crossed a line that I can't uncross." "But what if what I saw proves that he's been committing fraud?" Catherine pressed forward. "What if that signature belongs to my father, who died 15 years ago, and Aldrich has been using it on legal documents? Doesn't that matter?" Marcel closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, Catherine saw genuine sadness there. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "it's not my place or yours to investigate it. If you believe a crime has been committed, you need to take that information to the proper authorities. But you don't get to turn a private dining room into an interrogation chamber. You don't get to accuse one of our most valued patrons of fraud without evidence and expect to keep your job." "I have evidence," Catherine said, though even as she spoke, she knew how weak it sounded. "I recognize my father's signature. I've seen it thousands of times. I know his handwriting better than I know my own." Marcel spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "That's not evidence, Catherine. That's a feeling, an impression. It might be enough to start an investigation, but it's not enough to justify what you did tonight. And more to the point, it's not enough to save your job. I'm sorry, but I have to let you go. Effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay, and I'll make sure your final paycheck includes all accumulated tips. But I need your uniform and your access card, and I need you to leave the building within the next 30 minutes. The finality of it settled over Catherine like a shroud. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it was still devastating. This job had been her lifeline, the stable income that allowed her to support her mother and help her brother through college. Without it, she would be scrambling to find work in a city where good positions were scarce and competition was fierce. And if Aldrich made good on his threat to blacklist her among the high-end establishments, her options would be even more limited. But even as the practical fears crowded her mind, Catherine felt something else rising to push them back. It was the same fierce determination that had kept her standing in that private dining, the same stubborn refusal to accept convenient lies that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. She had lost her job, but she had also found something she hadn't even been looking for: proof that her father's death hadn't been the accident everyone claimed. Marcus Aldrich's threat, his barely concealed admission that Thomas Walsh had died because he stood up to powerful people, had transformed 15 years of vague suspicion into certainty. She stood up, reaching for the buttons on her uniform vest. "I understand," she said to Marcel. "I'm sorry for putting you in the... You've always been fair to me, and I respect that you have to do what's best for the club. But I want you to know that I'm not wrong about this. That signature belonged to my father, and Marcus Aldrich is using it to commit fraud. When the truth comes out, And it will come out. I hope you'll remember this conversation. Marcel didn't respond, but something in his expression suggested that her words had landed. He watched as she removed her vest and placed it on his desk, followed by her access card and her name tag. The act of removing these small pieces of professional identity felt like shedding skin, painful and necessary. When she was done, she stood there in her white blouse and black pants, suddenly just another person instead of a representative of the Belmont Club. "Security will escort you out," Marcel said, his voice gentler now. "It's procedure. Nothing personal. You can collect your things from your locker and then they'll walk you to the exit. Catherine, for what it's worth, I believe you saw what you say you saw. I just don't think you understand what you're up against. Men like Marcus Aldridge don't get where they are by being vulnerable to the kind of investigation you're talking about. They have layers of protection, legal teams, friends in every level of government and law enforcement. If you push this, you're not just risking your career. You're risking everything." It was the closest Marcel would come to warning her off. Catherine appreciated the concern, even as she rejected the advice. "I know," she said simply, "but it's my father, and I owe him the truth, no matter what it costs." The security escort was mercifully brief. Catherine collected her few personal items from her locker: a spare pair of shoes, a sweater, her phone charger, and a photo of her family taken the summer before her father died. The four of them standing on a beach, her father's arm around her mother, her brother grinning gap-toothed at the camera, and Catherine herself at 16, caught between childhood and adulthood, still believing the world was fundamentally fair. She looked at that photo now and felt the weight of everything that had changed since that moment. The security guard, a kind-faced man named Raymond who had always greeted her warmly when she arrived for her shifts, walked her to the service elevator in silence. When they reached the ground floor and he held the door open for her to exit into the night, he finally spoke. "Whatever you found up there," he said quietly, "be careful. This building has history, not all of it good. People who ask too many questions about the Meridian Tower have a way of running into bad luck." Catherine looked at him sharply, but Raymond's expression was unreadable. Before she could ask what he meant, he had stepped back into the elevator and the doors were closing, leaving her standing on the sidewalk outside the service entrance with her bag of belongings and a head full of questions. The night air was cool and carried the smell of rain. Traffic hummed past on the street. Taxis and private cars carrying people to destinations that suddenly seemed impossibly distant from where Catherine now stood. She pulled out her phone and called the one person she knew would answer no matter what time it was. Her brother picked up on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Cat? What's wrong? It's almost midnight." "Thomas," she said, and her voice cracked on his name. "I need you to come pick me up. I'm at the Meridian Tower. I just got fired, and I think I just found out why Dad died." There was a long pause, and then her brother's voice came back, suddenly alert and focused. "I'm on my way. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Catherine ended the call and leaned against the cold stone wall of the building, looking up at the tower rising above her into the night sky. 48 floors of glass and steel, a monument to architectural achievement and human ambition. Somewhere up there was the observation deck where her father had fallen, the place where Thomas Walsh's brilliant career and promising life had ended in violence disguised as misfortune. For 15 years, that death had been an unanswered question, a wound that never quite healed. Now, finally, Catherine had a thread to pull, a name to investigate, a direction for all the grief and rage she had been carrying. Marcus Aldridge thought he had silenced her by taking her job. He thought the threat of poverty and professional ruin would be enough to make her back down, but he had miscalculated badly. Catherine Walsh had been raised by a man who believed in doing the right thing no matter the cost, who had chosen integrity over safety and paid the ultimate price for that choice. She was her father's daughter in every way that mattered, and if seeking the truth about his death meant sacrificing her own security, then that was a price she was willing to pay. The real question was where to start. She had a signature and a suspicion, but she needed evidence that would hold up to scrutiny. She needed to understand what her father had been working on when he died. What project or design or idea had been valuable enough to kill for, and she needed to figure out how Marcus Aldridge, a man who claimed to be a self-made billionaire from a working-class background, had actually built his fortune on stolen work. As Catherine stood there in the cold, waiting for her brother to arrive, a plan began to form in her mind. It was risky and possibly illegal, but it was the only path she could see. She needed access to her father's old files, the boxes of documents and blueprints that her mother had stored in the attic of their old house and never had the heart to go through. Those files might contain proof of what Thomas Walsh had been, evidence that could be matched against Aldridge's supposedly original designs. And if she could find that proof, she would have the leverage she needed to force the truth into the light. A pair of headlights turned onto the street, and Catherine recognized her brother's battered Honda. Thomas pulled up to the curb and got out, wrapping her in a fierce hug before she could even speak. His hair was sticking up on one side and he was wearing sweatpants and a university hoodie, clearly having thrown on the first clothes he could find. But his eyes were sharp and focused, the same intense intelligence that had made their father so proud. "Tell me everything," he said, "and then tell me what we're going to do about it." They sat in Thomas's car in the parking lot of an all-night diner 3 blocks from the Meridian Tower, surrounded by the remnants of coffee and untouched food. Catherine had spent the last hour recounting every detail of the encounter with Marcus Aldridge, from the moment she'd seen the signature to his barely veiled threat as he left the private dining room. Her brother had listened without interrupting, his engineering mind processing the information with the same methodical precision their father had possessed. Now he sat back against the worn upholstery, his eyes distant as he worked through the implication. "That signature," Thomas said slowly, "you're absolutely certain it was Dad's? Not just similar, but identical?" Catherine nodded emphatically. "I've been looking at his signature my entire life, Tommy. I used to practice forging it when I was a teenager. I know every curve, every angle. What I saw tonight wasn't someone with similar handwriting. It was his signature. Exact in every detail, like Aldrich had traced it or practiced it thousands of times until he could reproduce it perfectly." Thomas ran his hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of their father that Catherine felt a pang in her chest. If Aldrich has been using Dad's signature for 20 years, like he claimed, that means he was using it 5 years before Dad died, which suggests he didn't just steal Dad's work after the fact. He was stealing it while Dad was still alive, using his signature to authorize things Dad never approved, or to claim ownership of things Dad created, Catherine added. "Think about it, Tommy. What if Dad designed something brilliant, something that could be worth billions, and Aldrich found a way to steal it? Dad would have confronted him, demanded credit or compensation, and Aldrich had him killed to keep him quiet." The words hung in the air between them, transforming a vague suspicion into a concrete accusation. Murder. They were talking about murder. About a calculated killing disguised as an industrial accident. It should have sounded absurd, like a conspiracy theory spun from grief and coincidence. But sitting there in the fluorescent glow of the diner parking lot, with the memory of Aldrich's threat still fresh in Catherine's mind, it felt like the only explanation that made sense. "We need to look at Dad's files," Thomas said, voicing the conclusion Catherine had already reached. "Mom kept everything, right? All his blueprints and documents and project notes?" Catherine nodded. "Everything's in boxes in her attic. She couldn't bear to sort through them after he died. I tried to help her once, about 5 years ago, but she got so upset we had to stop. The boxes have been sitting up there ever since, untouched." She pulled out her phone and checked the time. It was past midnight now. Too late to disturb their mother, but first thing in the morning they could drive over and start going through those files. "There's something else," Thomas said, his expression troubled. "I didn't want to say anything while you were talking, but the name Marcus Aldrich is completely unfamiliar to me. Last semester I had a class on contemporary architecture and urban development. We studied the Meridian Tower as an example of innovative structural design. The professor kept talking about how the building incorporated this revolutionary load-bearing system that made it possible to have the observation deck cantilever out over the street without external supports. He said it was Marcus Aldrich's design, that Aldrich had patented the system and licensed it to other buildings around the world." Catherine felt ice settle in her stomach. Dad was working on the Meridian Tower when he died. He was the senior architect. "Exactly," Thomas said. "So either Aldrich and Dad collaborated on this revolutionary design and Aldrich somehow ended up with sole credit, or Aldrich stole Dad's work outright and built his entire fortune on it. The patent alone would be worth hundreds of millions if it's being used in buildings worldwide." They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of what they were uncovering settling over them. If they were right, Marcus Aldrich wasn't just a fraud. He was a murderer who had built a billion-dollar empire on stolen innovation, using the signature of the man he'd killed to authorize and legitimize that theft. The audacity of it was staggering, and the danger they were now in was very real. Aldrich had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy Catherine's career for asking questions. What would he do if she and Thomas actually uncovered proof of his crimes? "We need to be smart about this," Thomas said, as though reading her thoughts. "We can't just go to the police with a theory. We need hard evidence, documentation that proves Dad created this design and that Aldrich stole it. Otherwise, it's our word against a billionaire's, and we both know how that ends." Catherine agreed, but she also knew they were racing against time. Aldrich was now aware that someone had recognized the signature. He would be taking steps to protect himself, destroying evidence, preparing legal defenses, using his considerable resources to make sure nothing could be traced back to him. They had a narrow window to act, and they couldn't afford to waste it. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Catherine glanced at the screen and felt her heart skip. It was from an unknown number, but the message made her blood run cold. "You should have walked away when you had the chance. Stop asking questions, or your brother will suffer the same accident your father did." She showed the message to Thomas, watching his face pale as he read it. The threat was explicit and terrifying, confirming everything they suspected. Aldrich wasn't just trying to silence them with legal intimidation. He was willing to kill again to protect his secret. Thomas's hands clenched into fists, and Catherine saw the same combination of fear and fury she felt reflected in his eyes. "We should go to the police," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Show them this threat, and tell them what?" Catherine countered. "That a billionaire is threatening us because I recognized a signature on a document I'm not supposed to have seen? They'll say it's a crank message, that we can't even prove Aldrich sent it. We need evidence of the original crime first. Then the threat becomes part of a pattern. Proof of consciousness of guilt." They decided to wait until morning to visit their mother and go through their father's files. Thomas insisted on driving Catherine back to her apartment and waiting until she was safely inside before leaving. He made her promise to keep her doors locked and to call him immediately if anything seemed suspicious. The threat against him had shaken them both, but it had also strengthened their resolve. Aldrich had made a critical error by threatening Thomas. He had shown his hand, revealed that he was desperate enough to consider violence, and desperation led to mistakes. Catherine barely slept that night. She lay in bed with her phone beside her, jumping at every sound, replaying the encounter with Aldridge over and over in her mind. She thought about her father standing on that observation deck 15 years ago, looking out over the city he'd helped build, not knowing that his last moments were approaching. Had he known he was in danger? Had he confronted Aldridge about the stolen signature, the misappropriated designs? Or had the attack come without warning, a sudden shove from behind that sent him plummeting into darkness? The thought made her sick with rage and grief. Thomas Walsh had been 43 years old at the peak of his career, with a family that loved him and a brilliant mind that could have contributed so much more to the world. Instead, he'd been murdered by someone who saw him not as a person but as an obstacle, someone whose work was valuable but whose life was expendable. And for 15 years that murderer had walked free, had built an empire on stolen innovation, had been celebrated as a self-made success story while the Walsh family struggled with poverty and unanswered questions. Morning came slowly, gray light filtering through Catherine's curtains. She was up before dawn, showered and dressed, and pacing her small apartment by the time Thomas texted that he was on his way to pick her up. They needed to coordinate their story for their mother. Laura Walsh had never fully recovered from her husband's death. She lived in a small apartment in a suburb 40 minutes from the city, surviving on Social Security and the modest life insurance payout that had barely covered the funeral expenses. She had aged rapidly after Thomas's death, her hair turning white, her face drawn with perpetual sadness. Catherine and her brother visited her every week, but they had learned to avoid talking about their father because it caused her such obvious pain. Now they were about to tear open that old wound and ask her to relive the worst period of her life, but there was no other way. The answers they needed were in those boxes in her attic, and they couldn't access them without her permission and cooperation. Laura was waiting for them when they arrived, alerted by Catherine's early morning call that something important had come up. She opened the door of her apartment wearing a faded bathrobe, her white hair pulled back in a simple bun, her eyes red-rimmed with worry. Both her children showing up unannounced at 7 in the morning could only mean bad news, and Catherine could see the fear in her mother's face as she ushered them inside. They sat at the small kitchen table where Catherine had eaten countless meals as a child, where her father had helped her with homework and discussed his work projects while her mother cooked dinner. The memory of those happier times made what Catherine had to say even harder. She reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "Mom," she began gently, "I need to ask you about Dad, about the work he was doing before he died. I know this is painful, but it's important." Laura's face closed down immediately, a defensive wall slamming into place. "Honey, we've been through this. Your father's death was an accident, a terrible, tragic accident. I know you want there to be more to it, some explanation that makes it make sense, but sometimes bad things just happen. Dwelling on it only makes the pain worse." Catherine squeezed her mother's hand. "I saw something last night, Mom, something that changes everything." She told the story as gently as she could about serving Marcus Aldridge, about recognizing the signature, about the confrontation and its consequences. As she spoke, she watched her mother's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to a dawning horror that confirmed what Catherine had suspected. Laura knew something, maybe not the full truth, but pieces of it that she'd never shared with her children. When Catherine finished, Laura sat in silence for a long moment. Then she pulled her hand free and stood up, walking to the window to stare out at the quiet suburban street. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I knew," she said. "Not everything, but I knew something was wrong. Thomas was so stressed those last few months before he died. He would come home late, shut himself in his study, spend hours on the phone arguing with someone. I asked him what was wrong, but he kept saying he was handling it, that he didn't want to worry me with work problems." She turned back to face them, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "The night before he died, he told me he'd made a decision. He was going to confront someone about something that had been stolen from him. He said he'd tried to handle it quietly, tried to work through proper channels, but nothing was being done. He was going to go public, expose what had been happening. He asked me to trust him, told me it would all be worth it when the truth came out." The next day he was dead. Thomas stood up and went to his mother, wrapping her in his arms. Did he say who he was going to confront? Did he mention Marcus Aldridge's name? Laura shook her head against her son's shoulder. He never mentioned names. He was trying to protect me, I think, trying to make sure I couldn't be implicated if things went wrong. But there were phone calls, angry calls in the weeks before he died. I would hear him saying things like, "You know it's mine and I won't let you steal this and I have proof." She pulled back, looking at both her children with eyes that held 15 years of suppressed knowledge. "I've always wondered if it really was an accident, but I was so scared. Scared of what the truth might be. Scared of what it would mean for you children if I started asking questions. So I told myself it was an accident and I tried to move on. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't fight for the truth back then." Catherine felt tears on her own cheeks now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication and determination. Her mother's confession had just confirmed everything. Thomas Walsh had been murdered for threatening to expose Marcus Aldridge's theft. And 15 years later, his children were going to finish what he started. They were going to find the proof he'd died protecting, and they were going to make sure the truth finally came to light. The attic access was in the hallway ceiling, a fold-down ladder that groaned in protest as Thomas pulled it into position. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of morning light that followed them up into the cramped space under the eaves. The attic was hot and close, filled with the accumulated debris of a family's history, old furniture, holiday decorations, boxes of childhood toys and school papers. But in the far corner, stacked against the sloped ceiling, were the boxes they'd come for. 8 cardboard containers, their sides faded and sagging with age, each one labeled in Laura's careful handwriting. Thomas Work Files 2009, Thomas Work Files 2010, and so on. Catherine and her brother worked in silence, carefully lowering the boxes one by one down the ladder to their mother, who stood below ready to receive them. Each box was surprisingly heavy, packed with blueprints, technical drawings, correspondence, and project files. When all 8 boxes were finally arranged on Laura's living room floor, they stood back and contemplated the magnitude of the task before them. 15 years of an architect's career, thousands of pages of documents, all potentially hiding the proof they needed. "We should be systematic about this," Thomas said, his engineering training kicking in. "Let's start with the year Dad died, 2010, and work backward. If he was planning to confront someone about stolen work, the evidence should be in his most recent files." They opened the box labeled 2010 and found it organized with typical Thomas Walsh precision. Manila folders arranged chronologically, each labeled with a project name and date. The Meridian Tower folder was thick, bulging with papers, and it was dated from January 2010 right up until October, just weeks before his death. Catherine pulled it out carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside were dozens of technical drawings, structural calculations, correspondence with contractors and clients, and meeting notes. Catherine spread them across the living room floor, creating a timeline of the project's development. As she and Thomas examined the documents, a story began to emerge. Thomas Walsh had been brought onto the Meridian Tower project as senior architect in late 2009, tasked with solving what the initial design team had deemed an impossible problem. The building's owner wanted an observation deck that would cantilever dramatically over the street, creating a breathtaking view and an architectural statement that would make the Meridian Tower a landmark. But the conventional engineering solutions would require massive external supports that would destroy the aesthetic vision. According to the notes, Thomas Walsh had spent months developing an innovative load-bearing system that distributed weight through an intricate network of internal trusses and counterweights. The design was elegant and unprecedented, allowing the observation deck to extend 60 feet beyond the building's footprint without any visible external support. Catherine found drawing after drawing in her father's distinctive, precise hand, each one refining the concept, working through calculations, testing stress points and failure modes. "Here," Thomas said suddenly, pulling out a letter dated March 2010. It was from Morrison & Blake, her father's firm, to the Meridian Towers Development Company. The letter outlined Thomas Walsh's completed design for the cantilever observation deck system and included a clause stating that Walsh retained intellectual property rights to the core structural innovation, though Morrison & Blake would maintain credit for the overall architectural design. It was standard practice, allowing architects to protect their individual innovations while still working as part of a larger firm. "So Dad protected himself legally," Catherine said. "He made sure there was a paper trail establishing his ownership of the design." Thomas nodded grimly. "Which means Aldridge couldn't simply claim the design was his. He would have needed Dad to sign away those rights, or he would have needed to forge documentation showing that the transfer had occurred." He kept digging through the folder and found what they'd been looking for. A series of letters dated between April and August 2010, each one more urgent than the last. The first letter was from a law firm Catherine didn't recognize, representing something called Aldridge Innovation Holdings. It requested a meeting with Thomas Walsh to discuss potential licensing of his cantilever design system for use in other projects. The tone was professional and courteous, offering what seemed like a reasonable licensing fee. But Thomas Walsh's reply, a copy of which was in the file, had politely declined, stating that he wasn't interested in licensing the design at that time and preferred to maintain exclusive rights until he could fully evaluate the commercial potential. The second letter, dated 6 weeks later, was less courteous. It claimed that Marcus Aldridge had been a consulting partner on the Meridian Tower project and had contributed substantially to the development of the cantilever system. It demanded that Thomas Walsh acknowledge this contribution in writing and agreed to a partnership arrangement that would give Kuhn Aldridge Innovation Holdings 50% ownership of the design patent. Thomas Walsh's response was clear and unequivocal. He had never worked with Marcus Aldridge as a partner or consultant on the Meridian Tower project, and any claims to the contrary were false. He threatened legal action if such claims continued. The third letter was where things turned dark. It was dated September 2010, just 2 months before Thomas Walsh's death, and the pretense of professional courtesy had been abandoned entirely. The letter, again from the law firm representing Aldridge, stated that their client had documentation proving his partnership role in the cantilever design development. It suggested that Thomas Walsh's refusal to acknowledge this partnership could be seen as fraud, potentially exposing him to criminal charges and civil liability. The letter demanded a meeting to resolve the matter before legal action became necessary. "Mom!" Catherine called out, bringing Laura into the living room from where she'd been making tea in the kitchen. "Did Dad ever mention a meeting with lawyers in September or October 2010? Laura set down the tea tray, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up the threatening letter and read it. He did, she said slowly. He came home one night in late September, absolutely furious. He said someone was trying to steal his work, claiming they'd been partners when they'd never even met. He said he had proof, documentation showing he'd developed the entire design independently, and he was going to expose the fraud. She looked up at her children, her face pale. That was when the phone calls started. Calls at all hours, often in the middle of the night. When I would answer, no one would speak, they would just hang up. Thomas changed our number, but within a week the calls started again. Someone was trying to intimidate. Thomas was sorting through more papers and suddenly held up a small bound notebook. It was a project journal, the kind architects kept to document their creative process and problem solving. This is gold, he said, flipping through pages of sketches and calculations and dated notes, all in their father's handwriting. This shows the evolution of Dad's thinking, proves he developed the cantilever system step by step over months. There's no way Aldridge could have been a partner if all the developmental work is documented in Dad's private journal, but there was more. Tucked into the back of the journal was a folded photocopy of a patent application. Catherine unfolded it carefully and her breath caught. It was an application for a structural engineering patent titled Cantilever Support System for High-Rise Observation Deck, filed in August 2010 in the name of Marcus Aldridge and Aldridge Innovation Holdings. The technical drawings attached to the application were identical to the ones in Thomas Walsh's project folder, down to the smallest detail. Someone had photocopied her father's work, changed the name on the application, and filed it as original innovation. The audacity of it was staggering. Aldridge hadn't just tried to force Thomas Walsh into acknowledging him as a partner. He had actually filed a patent application using stolen designs, creating a legal record that would give him ownership of the innovation. If the patent went through, Aldridge would have the right to license the design to other buildings, to sue anyone who tried to use similar systems, to profit from Thomas Walsh's genius while the actual inventor got nothing. Look at the filing date, Thomas said, pointing. August 2010. That's right after Dad refused to acknowledge Aldridge as a partner. He must have realized he couldn't force Dad to cooperate, so he just filed the patent anyway, figuring Dad would never see it until it was too late. But Dad did see it, Catherine said, holding up the photocopy. He must have had connections in the patent office, or maybe his lawyers were monitoring applications in his field. He got a copy of this fraudulent filing, and that's when he decided to go public. She rifled through the remaining papers in the folder and found what she was looking for. A draft letter addressed to the State Board of Architects and Engineers, detailing the attempted theft and requesting an investigation. The letter was dated October 14, 2010. According to the police report, Thomas Walsh had died on October 15, the day after he'd written this letter. The timeline was damning. Thomas Walsh discovered the fraudulent patent application, drafted a formal complaint to the regulatory board, and died the next day in what was ruled an accidental fall. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Aldridge must have known Walsh was preparing to expose him, perhaps through an informant at Morrison and Blake or through illegal surveillance, and he had acted decisively to silence the threat. We need to see if that patent was actually granted, Thomas said, already pulling at his laptop. If Aldridge successfully obtained the patent based on stolen designs, that's documentary proof of fraud. Combined with Dad's original work in this journal showing his development process, we can prove the theft beyond any doubt. It took Thomas less than 10 minutes to locate the patent record on the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office website. Patent number 8742651, granted to Marcus Aldridge and Aldridge Innovation Holdings in December 2011, more than a year after Thomas Walsh's death. The patent abstract described a revolutionary cantilever support system for high-rise structures, exactly as Thomas Walsh had designed it. And according to the Patent Office records, the design had been licensed to 17 major construction projects worldwide, generating licensing fees estimated at over $500 million. $500 million. That was what Thomas Walsh's life had been worth to Marcus Aldridge. That was the price tag on murder, on stolen innovation, on 15 years of lies and the destruction of a family. Catherine felt a cold rage settling over her, burning away the fear and uncertainty that had plagued her since the confrontation at the Belmont Club. They had proof now. Undeniable documentation that showed the theft, the timeline, and the motive. What they didn't have was proof of the murder itself. That's going to be the hard part, Laura said quietly, as though reading Catherine's thoughts. Proving that Thomas's death wasn't an accident. The police investigation was closed within a week. They interviewed people at the construction site, examined the observation deck, and concluded that Thomas had been working alone after hours, checking stress calculations on the actual structure. They said he must have leaned against a temporary railing that wasn't properly secured, and it gave way. There were no witnesses, no security cameras in that part of the building yet. Just an accident. Thomas was frowning at his laptop. I'm looking at the construction timeline for the Meridian Tower. The observation deck was scheduled to be accessible in October 2010. It was still under construction, not even close to finish. So what was Dad doing up there in the first place? Laura's face went pale. The police asked me that, and they said Thomas had told the night security guard that he needed to check some measurements before a crucial meeting the next day. The guard gave him access because he was the senior architect on the project. He went up alone, and half an hour later the guard heard the fall. By the time emergency services arrived, Thomas was gone. But who was the meeting with? Catherine pressed. Did Dad tell you? Did he mention why those specific measurements were so urgent? Laura shook her head. He didn't tell me about any meeting. He'd been so secretive those last few weeks, trying to protect me from whatever was happening. She paused, a thought occurring to her, but there was a business card. The police gave me a bag with Thomas's personal effects, the things he had on him when he died. His wallet, his watch, his phone was destroyed in the fall, and there was a business card in his jacket pocket. I kept it with his other thing. She disappeared into her bedroom and returned a moment later with a small wooden box. Inside, carefully preserved, were the artifacts of Thomas Walsh's last day. His wallet, worn leather with his driver's license still visible through the plastic window. His watch, the crystal cracked from the impact. And a business card, creased and slightly worn as though it had been handled repeatedly. Catherine picked it up carefully. The card was expensive. Embossed lettering on heavy stock. Marcus Aldridge, it read. President Aldridge Innovation Holdings. And on the back, written in her father's handwriting, was a time and place. Meridian Tower Observation Deck, 8 p.m. October 15th. The business card changed everything. It wasn't just proof that Thomas Walsh had planned to meet with Marcus Aldridge. It was evidence that Aldridge had lured him to an isolated location at night, to an unfinished observation deck with incomplete safety measures, and that Thomas Walsh had died at exactly that time and place. The police had ruled it an accident because they hadn't known about the meeting. Hadn't understood that Walsh wasn't there on routine business, but had been summoned by the very man who stood to lose everything if Walsh's complaints went forward. Catherine photographed the business card from every angle, making sure the handwriting was clearly visible. Then she photographed every page of her father's journal, every letter from Aldridge's lawyers, every technical drawing and calculation that proved the cantilever design was Thomas Walsh's original work. Thomas did the same with his phone, creating redundant backups of the evidence. If something happened to one of them, the other would still have proof. We need to take this to the police, Laura said, but her voice was uncertain. She had lived 15 years believing the official story, and the sudden revelation that her husband had been murdered was overwhelming. These are good detectives, honest people. They'll listen to us now that we have evidence. Thomas shook his head. Mom, think about it. Aldridge has been operating freely for 15 years. He's built relationships with everyone who matters in this city, including law enforcement. His company donates millions to police charities, sponsors, community programs, funds political campaign. If we walk into a police station with this evidence, whoever we talk to will feel obligated to inform their superiors. And those superiors will want to verify our claims before taking action against one of the city's most prominent citizens. That gives Aldridge time to prepare his defense, destroy additional evidence, maybe even come after us more aggressively. So what do we do? Catherine asked, though she already had an idea forming. We need to go public in a way that Aldridge can't suppress. We need media coverage, attention from outlets he doesn't control. Once the story is out there, once people know what we've found, it becomes much harder for him to silence us. Thomas pulled up his laptop again and started searching. There's an investigative journalist named Rebecca Chun who works for the Metropolitan Post. She's done several exposés on corporate fraud and corruption, won a Pulitzer 3 years ago for uncovering a bribery scheme in the construction industry. If anyone will take this seriously and have the resources to verify our evidence independently, it's her. Catherine remembered Rebecca Chun's work. The reporter was known for her tenacity and her refusal to be intimidated by powerful interests. Several of her investigations had resulted in criminal prosecutions and massive financial settlements. If they could get Chun interested in the story, she would dig deeper than they ever could. Would use her journalistic credentials to access records and interview people who wouldn't talk to ordinary citizens. And once she published, the story would be protected by the Post's legal team and journalistic privilege. Thomas found Chun's contact information on the Post's website and drafted an email. He kept it brief and professional, outlining the basic facts. A billionaire built his fortune on a design stolen from a murdered architect, and the victim's children had documentary proof. He included Catherine's phone number and sent the email before any of them could second-guess the decision. Now they had to wait and hope that Rebecca Chun saw the message amid what was surely an avalanche of daily tips and story pitches. They didn't have to wait long. Catherine's phone rang less than an hour later, an unknown number with a city area code. She answered cautiously, and a woman's voice, sharp and energetic, came through. "This is Rebecca Chun from the Metropolitan Post. I just read an email about stolen patents and murder. Tell me everything and don't leave anything out." Catherine spent the next 45 minutes on the phone, walking Chun through the entire story from the moment she'd seen the signature at the Belmont Club to the discovery of Aldridge's business card among her father's effects. Chun asked pointed questions, requesting specific dates and document details, occasionally interrupting to verify facts or push for clarification. It was clear she was taking notes and equally clear that she was intrigued. "I'm going to need to see all that documentation," Chun said when Catherine finished. "Original documents if possible, photographs if not, and I'll need to interview all three of you on the record. This is the kind of story that requires bulletproof sourcing. If I'm going to accuse Marcus Aldridge of murder and theft, I need to be absolutely certain of my facts." They arranged to meet that afternoon at Chun's office at the Post. Catherine felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as she ended the call. They were committed now, moving forward with a plan that would either expose the truth or make them even bigger targets. But at least they were taking action instead of hiding in fear. Laura insisted on coming with them to the meeting despite Catherine's concerns about her mother's health. "This is about your father," Laura said firmly. "I should have fought for the truth 15 years ago, and I won't sit on the sidelines now." Catherine understood. Her mother needed this, needed to be part of seeking justice for the man she'd loved and lost. The Metropolitan Post occupied 5 floors of a building in the media district, a bustling hive of journalists, editors, and researchers working on stories that would shape public discourse. Rebecca Chun's office was on the 4th floor, a glass-walled space filled with filing cabinets, whiteboards covered in notes and timeline, and stacks of documents that spoke to ongoing investigations. Chun herself was in her early 40s with short black hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She greeted them with handshakes and immediately got down to business. For the next 3 hours, Chun examined every piece of evidence they'd brought. She made copies, took photographs, cross-referenced dates and names. She pulled up the patent office records on her computer and compared the filed designs to Thomas Walsh's original drawing. She made phone calls to sources, verifying details about the Meridian Tower construction timeline and Marcus Aldridge's business history. And she asked questions, hundreds of questions, testing the strength of their story from every angle. Finally, she sat back in her chair and looked at the 3 of them. "This is one of the most compelling stories I've seen in years," she said. "If everything you've told me checks out, and my preliminary verification suggests it will, Marcus Aldridge committed fraud on a massive scale and almost certainly murdered your father to cover it up. But I need to warn you about what happens next. The moment I start making official inquiries, Aldridge will know someone is investigating. He'll lawyer up, start destroying evidence, possibly take action against you. Are you prepared for that?" "We've already gotten death threats," Thomas said, showing Chun the text message Catherine had received. "Aldridge knows we're asking questions. At this point, our best protection is publicity. The more people who know the story, the harder it will be for him to make us disappear." Chun nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. All right, here's how this is going to work. I need about a week to do a full investigation, interview sources, verify every fact. I want to talk to people at Morrison & Blake, the construction company that built the Meridian Tower, the patent office, anyone who had contact with your father in the months before his death. I'm also going to reach out to Aldridge's representatives and give him a chance to respond to the allegations. Journalistic ethics require it, even though I'm sure he'll deny everything." "What if he tries to stop the story?" Catherine asked. "He has resources, connections. Can't he pressure the Post not to publish?" Chun smiled grimly. "Try. But the Post has a long tradition of standing up to powerful people who don't like our reporting. If the story is solid, and this one appears to be, we'll publish regardless of pressure. That said, you need to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone. Vary your routines. Let people know where you are at all times. I've covered enough stories like this to know that desperate people do desperate things." They left the Post building as the afternoon sun slanted through the city streets, casting long shadows that seemed ominous despite the clear sky. Catherine felt exposed, vulnerable, as though a target had been painted on her back. Every passing car could contain someone sent by Aldridge. Every stranger on the sidewalk could be watching them. Thomas must have felt the same because he stayed close, his hand hovering near Catherine's elbow, ready to pull her to safety if needed. They decided to stay together at Laura's apartment for the next week. Safety in numbers, Thomas reasoned, and Laura's building had decent security with a doorman and cameras in the lobby. Catherine went back to her apartment only long enough to pack a bag, and Thomas did the same. By evening, they were settled in Laura's small living room, the boxes of Thomas Walsh's files stacked in the corner like silent witnesses to their mission. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She lay on the pull-out sofa in the living room, listening to the city sounds filtering through the windows, thinking about her father. Had he felt this same mixture of fear and determination in the days before he died? Had he known he was in danger, or had he believed that truth and justice would protect him? She wanted to believe that he would be proud of what they were doing, that he would approve of their decision to finish what he'd started, but she also wondered if he would have wanted them to risk their safety for his vindication. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Catherine's heart jumped, but it wasn't another threat. It was Rebecca Chun. "Just interviewed someone from Morrison & Blake who remembers your father. Says he was the most ethical architect they ever employed. Also confirmed that Aldridge approached the firm in October 2010 claiming to be a consulting partner on the Meridian Tower project. The firm told him to pound sand because they had no record of his involvement. 2 weeks later, your father was dead. This is bigger than we thought. We'll update tomorrow." Catherine felt a chill run through her. Morrison & Blake had turned Aldridge away, refusing to support his false claims of partnership. That rejection must have been what pushed him to desperate measures. If he couldn't establish a legal claim to the design through the architecture firm, so his only option was to eliminate the one person who could definitively prove the theft. Thomas Walsh's death hadn't been a crime of passion or a sudden decision. It had been calculated murder, planned and executed because Aldridge saw no other way to secure his stolen fortune. She thought about the man she'd served at the Belmont Club, the polished billionaire in his expensive suit with his air of absolute confidence. How many people had he destroyed on his path to wealth and power? How many other Thomas Walshes were out there, victims of his ruthlessness who had never gotten justice? The thought made her angry, a clean, burning anger that pushed away the fear. Marcus Aldridge had gotten away with murder for 15 years. had lived in luxury while the Walsh family struggled with poverty and grief, but his time was running out. Rebecca Chun was building a case against him, and when the story broke, his carefully constructed empire would start to crumble. The next morning brought another text from Chun. Found the night security guard who was on duty when your father died. He's retired now, living in Florida. I'm flying down there tomorrow to interview him. He says there's something about that night that never sat right with him. Something he didn't tell the police because he thought it didn't matter. I'll call you when I have more. Catherine showed the message to Thomas and Laura over breakfast. The security guard might be the witness they needed, the person who could place Aldridge at the scene or contradict the official accident narrative. Everything was falling into place, and yet Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, that Aldridge was preparing his own response to their investigation. Men like him didn't go down without a fight, and the closer they got to exposing him, the more dangerous he would become. Rebecca Chun called from Florida 2 days later, and Catherine could hear the controlled excitement in her voice. I just spent 3 hours with Ronald Martinez, the security guard who was on duty the night your father died. Catherine, this man has been carrying guilt for 15 years because he never told anyone what he actually saw that night. He thought it wasn't relevant, that it would just complicate the investigation. But it changes everything. Catherine put the call on speaker so Thomas and Laura could hear. What did he see? Martinez says your father arrived at the Meridian Tower at 7:45 that night, 15 minutes before the meeting time written on Aldridge's business card. He signed in at the security desk, told Martinez he had a meeting on the observation deck to discuss design modifications. Martinez gave him access and thought nothing of it. But here's the thing, 10 minutes later Marcus Aldridge arrived. Martinez recognized him because Aldridge had been at the site several times over the previous weeks, always asking questions about Thomas Walsh, about his schedule, about when he worked late. Martinez found it odd, but figured Aldridge was just an investor checking on the project. So Aldridge was there, Laura breathed. He was there when Thomas died. It gets worse, Chun continued. Martinez says he directed Aldridge to the observation deck, then went back to his desk in the lobby. About 15 minutes later, he heard a commotion, saw Aldridge running out of the construction elevator, shouting that there had been an accident. Aldridge claimed he'd arrived at the observation deck just in time to see Walsh lose his balance and fall. Said he tried to grab him but couldn't reach him in time. Martinez called 911 immediately, and Aldridge stayed until the police arrived. Gave a statement, played the role of the horrified witness. But Martinez didn't believe him, Catherine said, understanding where this was going. Not entirely, Chun confirmed. He said Aldridge was too composed, too controlled for someone who had just watched a man die. There was no shock in his voice, no trembling hands, nothing that suggested genuine trauma. And there was something else. When the police searched the observation deck, they found scuff marks near the edge, signs of a struggle that the investigators dismissed as construction debris. But Martinez saw those marks before they brought your father's body down, and he said they looked fresh, like someone had been dragged or had fought against being pushed. The words hung in the air, transforming the abstract concept of murder into something visceral and horrific. Thomas Walsh had fought for his life on that observation deck. He had struggled against Marcus Aldridge, had tried to save himself, and ultimately had been overpowered and thrown to his death. The image made Catherine feel sick, but it also filled her with a cold determination. This wasn't just about exposing fraud anymore. This was about making sure a murderer faced justice. Why didn't Martinez tell the police this at the time? Thomas asked, his voice tight with anger. Chun sighed. He says he was scared. Aldridge pulled him aside before the police arrived and told him how tragic it was, how important it was that the investigation be handled sensitively for the family's sake. He suggested that mentioning unnecessary details like the scuff marks or his own presence at the scene would just complicate things and make the Walsh family's grief worse. Then he gave Martinez a business card and said if he ever needed anything, any help at all, he should call. Martinez interpreted it as a bribe and a threat all at once. He kept quiet, told the police exactly what Aldridge wanted him to say, and then spent the next 15 years wondering if he'd helped a murderer get away with it. He did, Laura said quietly. He helped Marcus Aldridge destroy my family and walk away free. But he's willing to talk now, Chun said. He's willing to give a full statement, go on the record, testify if necessary. He says he's dying of lung cancer, has maybe a year left, and he wants to clear his conscience before he goes. That's credible testimony from a witness who was actually there, who saw Aldridge at the scene and observed his behavior after. Combined with the documentary evidence of the stolen patent and the threatening letters, it's enough to reopen the investigation. Catherine felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. They were so close now to having everything they needed. But Aldridge had to know that time was running out for him. Chun had been making inquiries for days, talking to sources, requesting documents. Word of the investigation would have reached him by now, and he would be preparing his response. As if reading her thoughts, Chun's tone turned serious. I need to tell you something else. This morning I received a call from Aldridge's legal team. They know I'm investigating, and they're threatening to sue me and the Post for defamation if we publish anything based on unsubstantiated allegation. They claim Aldridge has documentation proving he was a legitimate consulting partner on the Meridian Tower. project and that any suggestion of fraud or foul play is malicious libel. Can they stop you from publishing? Thomas asked. Chun laughed, but there was no humor in it. They can try, but I've been threatened by better lawyers than Aldridge's team, and I'm still here. The Post's legal department is reviewing everything, and they're confident we're on solid ground. We have original documents, expert analysis of the patent theft, and now eyewitness testimony placing Aldridge at the scene of your father's death. That's not defamation. That's investigative journalism. The story runs in 3 days. Front page, above the fold. 3 days. Catherine felt time compressing, accelerating toward an inevitable confrontation. In 72 hours, the truth would be public. Marcus Aldridge's carefully constructed life would be exposed as a fraud, and the investigation into Thomas Walsh's death would be reopened. But those 3 days gave Aldridge's time to act, to make one last desperate attempt to silence the story before it could destroy him. That afternoon, Catherine's phone rang again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was unmistakable. Marcus Aldridge, smooth and controlled, as though he were calling to make a dinner reservation rather than threaten the woman who was about to destroy him. Miss Walsh, he said pleasantly, I hope you're well. I understand you've been quite busy lately talking to journalists, making wild accusations. I thought perhaps we should have a conversation before this situation gets completely out of hand. Catherine's hand tightened on the phone. She put it on speaker so Thomas could hear. We have nothing to talk about, Mr. Aldridge. You murdered my father and stole his work. The evidence is going to be published, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Evidence can be misleading, Aldridge said, his voice hardening slightly. Context matters, Miss Walsh. Your father was a troubled man in the months before his death. Did you know he was being treated for depression? That he'd been making mistakes on the job, missing deadline? Morrison and Blake were considering letting him go. The stress may have contributed to his tragic accident. That's a lie, Catherine said, her voice shaking with anger. My father wasn't depressed or incompetent. He was being threatened by you because he wouldn't let you steal his work. Aldridge sighed, a practiced sound of patient exasperation. I'm trying to help you, Catherine. May I call you Catherine? You're about to make a terrible mistake. One that will destroy your own reputation along with your father's. Think about your brother. He's studying engineering, isn't he? Imagine how his career prospects will look when potential employers learned that his sister publicly accused a respected businessman of murder based on paranoid conspiracy theories. Imagine your mother having to relive her husband's death in the media spotlight, having every detail of their private life examined and questioned. The threat was clear. Aldridge wasn't just going after Catherine. He was going after her entire family, threatening to destroy their futures if she didn't back down. But Catherine had learned something important over the past few days. Bullies like Aldridge only threatened when they were afraid, when they knew they were losing control. His call wasn't a display of power. It was evidence of desperation. My father's legacy is going to be restored, Catherine said firmly. The truth is going to come out and you're going to prison. That's what's going to happen in 3 days, Mr. Aldridge. I suggest you use that time to get your affairs. She ended the call and immediately phoned Rebecca Chun to report the contact. Chun was unsurprised. That was a mistake on his part, she said. Contacting you directly, making threats. That's consciousness of guilt. I'm going to include it in the story. Aldridge is panicking, Catherine. That makes him predictable, but also more dangerous. Don't go anywhere alone, and if he contacts you again, record the conversation. That night, Catherine and Thomas took turns keeping watch while the others slept. It seemed paranoid, but the threat from Aldridge felt increasingly real. A man who had killed once to protect his secrets wouldn't hesitate to kill again. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of traffic outside and Laura's soft snoring from the bedroom. Thomas sat by the window, watching the street below for any signs of surveillance or suspicious activity. Around 2 in the morning, Catherine's laptop, which she'd left open on the kitchen table, pinged with an email notification. She walked over and felt her blood run cold. The email was from an anonymous account, no subject line, and the message contained a single photograph. It was a picture of Thomas leaving his university campus, taken earlier that day from a distance with a telephoto lens. Beneath the photo was a message in block capital, "Back off OR, he's next." Catherine woke Thomas immediately, showing him the email. Her brother's face went pale as he looked at the photograph. Someone had followed him, had been watching him all day, and he hadn't noticed. The implication was clear and terrifying. Aldridge could get to them whenever he wanted. Their safety was an illusion, and the 3 days until publication seemed like an eternity of vulnerability. They called the police that night, finally making an official report. The responding officers were professional but skeptical. They took statements, made copies of the threatening emails and texts, filed a report, but Catherine could see they didn't fully understand the danger. To them, this was a dispute between a waitress and a billionaire, probably some kind of misunderstanding or exaggeration. They promised to increase patrols in the area and suggested Catherine and her family consider staying somewhere else until the situation resolved itself. But where could they go that Aldridge couldn't find them? He had resources they couldn't imagine, connections in every level of city infrastructure. If he wanted to locate them, he would. Their only protection now was publicity, making sure enough people knew the story that harming them would be obviously suspicious. Catherine called Rebecca Chun again, waking the journalist from sleep, and told her about the photograph and the threat. Chuan's response was immediate and decisive. "That's it. We're moving the publication date up. The story runs tomorrow morning, online edition at 6 a.m. Print edition hits the streets at 7. I've got everything I need, and waiting another 2 days just gives Aldridge more time to hurt someone. Go to a hotel tonight, use cash, don't tell anyone where you are. Once the story's public, you'll be safer than you are right now in this limbo. They followed Chun's advice, packing quickly and leaving Laura's apartment in the middle of the night. Thomas drove a circuitous route through the city, checking constantly for following vehicles, while Catherine searched her phone for hotels that might accept cash payment. They eventually found a small motel near the airport, the kind of anonymous place that catered to travelers who valued privacy over comfort. The room was cramped and smelled of cigarette smoke despite the no smoking sign, but it felt safer than anywhere they'd been in days. Laura sat on one of the twin beds, looking small and fragile in the harsh fluorescent light. I never thought it would come to this, she said quietly. Hiding in a motel room, running from a murderer. Your father fought this man and lost. What makes us think we can win? Because we're not alone, Catherine said, sitting beside her mother and taking her hand. Dad was alone when he confronted Aldridge. He tried to handle it through proper channels, tried to be ethical and patient, and it got him killed. But we have Rebecca Chun and the Metropolitan Post behind us. We have evidence Dad never got to present, and we have each other. That's what makes this different. Thomas was standing by the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the parking lot below. The story runs in less than 4 hours, he said. Once it's out there, once everyone knows what Aldridge did, he loses his power. The truth becomes public record, and if anything happens to us, it'll be obviously connected to the expose. He'll be the first suspect. That's our protection. Catherine hoped her brother was right, but she also knew they were in the most dangerous phase of this entire ordeal. The hours before dawn, when the story would break and transform their private investigation into a public scandal, were when Aldridge would be most desperate. If he was going to make a move, it would be now. In this window before publication, when he still had plausible deniability. She pulled out her phone and checked the Metropolitan Post's website obsessively, refreshing every few minutes, waiting for the story to appear. The hours before dawn stretched like an eternity. Catherine sat on the motel bed with her laptop open, refreshing the Metropolitan Post's homepage every 30 seconds. Thomas had wedged a chair under the door handle as an additional security measure, and he sat in the corner with a view of both the door and the window, his phone in one hand and a heavy metal lamp base in the other. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all they had. Laura had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep on the other bed, her face peaceful in a way Catherine hadn't seen in years. Perhaps knowing that justice was finally coming had given her mother some measure of peace. At 5:47 in the morning, Catherine's screen flickered and refreshed to show a breaking news banner across the top of the Metropolitan Post's website. Her breath caught as she read the headline, "Billionaire's empire built on stolen innovation and murder. Exclusive investigation reveals decades of fraud." Below it was Rebecca Chun's byline and a photograph of Marcus Aldridge at some charity gala, smiling confidently at the camera, completely unaware that his world was about to end. Catherine's hands trembled as she clicked through to the full article. Chun had written a masterpiece of investigative journalism, laying out the case with devastating clarity. The story began with Catherine's encounter at the Belmont Club, the signature that had started everything. Then it moved methodically through the evidence. Thomas Walsh's original designs and project journal, the fraudulent patent application filed by Aldridge, the threatening letters from his lawyers, and the patent that had generated over $500 million in licensing fees from a design Aldridge had never created. But the most damning section was Chun's interview with Ronald Martinez, the security guard. His testimony about Aldridge's presence at the scene, his too calm demeanor after witnessing a death, and the suspicious scuff marks that suggested a struggle was presented with careful precision. Chun had even obtained the original police report and highlighted the inconsistency that had been overlooked in the rush to rule the death accidental. The article included photographs of key documents, including the business card with Thomas Walsh's handwriting that proved he had arranged to meet Aldridge at the exact time and place he died. The final section was perhaps the most powerful. Chun had tracked down 3 other inventors and entrepreneurs who claimed Aldridge had stolen their work over the years, using his wealth and legal resources to force them into silence or settlements with non-disclosure agreement. A pattern emerged of a man who had built his fortune not on innovation but on systematic theft, identifying promising ideas from vulnerable creators and then taking them through intimidation, fraud, or worse. The article ended with a call for a criminal investigation into Thomas Walsh's death and a comprehensive audit of all patents held by Aldridge Innovation Hold. Thomas, Catherine said, her voice breaking. Read this. It's perfect. She's done it. Her brother crossed the room and read over her shoulder, his expression shifting from tension to something like vindication. The article was being shared rapidly across social media. Within minutes of publication, it had thousands of comments and retweets. People were outraged, demanding justice, calling for Aldridge's arrest. The story was trending on every platform, spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. By 6:30 in the morning, other news outlets were picking up the story. citing the Metropolitan Post's investigation and adding their own commentary. Television news programs broke into regular programming to discuss the allegations. Catherine watched on her phone as talking heads debated the evidence. Legal experts analyzed the implication, and business reporters discussed what this might mean for Aldridge's company and the construction projects that had licensed his stolen patent. The response from Aldridge himself came at 7:15, a carefully worded statement from his legal team that neither confirmed nor denied the allegations, but called the Metropolitan Post's reporting irresponsible and promised vigorous legal action. The statement claimed that Aldridge had been a collaborative partner with Thomas Walsh on the cantilever design and that Walsh's tragic death had been thoroughly investigated and ruled accidental by competent authorities. It suggested that the Walsh family's accusations were motivated by financial desperation and grief-driven delusion, but the statement felt hollow and defensive, especially when compared to the mountain of evidence Chun had presented. Social media users tore it apart within minutes, pointing out that collaborative partners don't typically file patents in their own name without crediting the other inventor, and that grief-driven delusions don't usually come with authenticated documentation and eyewitness testimony. The more Aldridge's lawyers tried to spin the narrative, the worse they made it look. By 8 o'clock, the police commissioner held a press conference announcing that the department would be reopening the investigation into Thomas Walsh's death in light of new evidence. The commissioner looked uncomfortable, clearly aware that the original investigation had been cursory, and that his department was about to face intense scrutiny for missing obvious signs of foul play 15 years ago. He promised a thorough review and said detectives would be contacting the Walsh family shortly to take formal statements. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the press conference on her laptop. It was happening. After 15 years of silence and injustice, the system was finally responding. Her father's death would be investigated properly. Aldridge would face consequences. The stolen design would be attributed to its true creator. Everything they had fought for was coming to pass. Laura woke to find both her children crying and initially panicked, thinking something terrible had happened. But when they showed her the article and explained that the story had broken and was being taken seriously, she collapsed into sobs of her own. For 15 years, she had carried the weight of her husband's death, had accepted the official story even while doubting it, had tried to move on while never quite healing. Now, finally, someone believed her. Someone had listened to the doubts she'd been too afraid to voice and had proven them justified. And the three of them sat together on the motel bed, reading comments and watching news coverage and marveling at how quickly the world could change when truth was finally brought to light. Catherine's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters requesting interviews, from old friends who had seen the story, from Thomas's university professors who wanted to express support. She let most of them go to voicemail, but she did answer when Rebecca Chun called. "You did it," Chun said, her voice warm with satisfaction. "This story is everywhere. I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never seen a response like this. People are angry, Catherine. They're demanding justice for your father. The pressure on law enforcement is going to be enormous. They won't be able to sweep this under the rug." "Thank you," Catherine said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "You gave my father a voice when no one else would listen. You made people care about what happened." "That's the job," Chun said simply. "But you're the one who had the courage to speak up in the first place. You saw that signature and you didn't let it go, even when it cost you everything. That takes real strength, Catherine. Your father would be proud." After they ended the call, Catherine thought about that. Would her father be proud, or would he be horrified that his children had put themselves in danger to avenge him? She wanted to believe he would understand, that he would recognize the same commitment to truth and justice that had defined his own life. He had died trying to expose Aldridge's fraud. They had finished what he started. That had to mean something. By mid-morning, the Metropolitan Post published a follow-up article revealing that federal prosecutors were now reviewing the patent fraud allegations and considering whether to file criminal charges. The article noted that if Aldridge had knowingly filed a patent application using stolen designs, he could face multiple felony counts carrying significant prison time. Additionally, the Patent Office was initiating its own investigation and had placed a hold on all licensing agreements related to the cantilever design pending resolution of the ownership dispute. Catherine watched Aldridge's empire begin to crumble in real time. His company's stock price plummeted as investors panicked and fled. Several major construction projects announced they were suspending licensing payments until the patent dispute was resolved. Board members of various foundations and organizations where Aldridge held prominent positions began resigning or calling for his removal. The Belmont Club, in a statement clearly designed to distance themselves from the scandal, announced that they were reviewing all relationships with Aldridge-affiliated entities. The speed of his fall was dizzying. Just 2 days ago, Marcus Aldridge had been an untouchable billionaire, a pillar of the business community, a man whose threats could destroy lives with a phone call. Now he was radioactive, abandoned by allies who didn't want to be tainted by association with an accused murderer and fraud. Catherine felt no sympathy for him. This was exactly what he deserved. The consequences he had escaped for 15 years finally catching up with him. But even as she watched his public destruction, Catherine remained aware that cornered animals were the most dangerous. Aldridge had lost everything in the space of a few hours. His reputation was destroyed, his business was collapsing, criminal prosecution was looming. A man with nothing left to lose might decide that revenge was all that remained. The threatening email with Thomas's photograph was still fresh in her mind. Just because the story was public didn't mean they were completely safe. As if to confirm her fears, her phone rang with another unknown number. Catherine hesitated, then answered. A man's voice, not Aldridge's, but cold and professional, spoke without preamble. Miss Walsh, you've made a serious mistake, Mayor. Aldridge is prepared to offer a settlement. $5 million to your family in exchange for a public retraction of your accusations and an acknowledgement that your father's death was indeed accidental. The offer expires in 24 hours. Catherine felt anger surge through her. Even now, even with everything collapsing around him, Aldridge thought he could buy his way out. He thought that money could make truth disappear, that the Walsh family could be purchased like they were just another problem to be solved with his checkbook. Tell Mr. Aldridge, Catherine said, her voice icy with controlled rage, that no amount of money will ever be enough. My father's integrity isn't for sale. Our testimony isn't for sale. And justice isn't something he can negotiate his way out of. The answer is no. It will always be no. She ended the call and immediately reported it to Rebecca Chun, who promised to include the attempted bribery in her next article. Another piece of evidence showing consciousness of guilt. Another demonstration that Aldridge knew exactly what he'd done and was desperately trying to avoid the consequences. By afternoon, 2 detectives from the homicide division arrived at the motel to take formal statements. They were professional and respectful, treating Catherine, Thomas, and Laura not as delusional conspiracy theorists, but as key witnesses in a murder investigation. They spent hours going through every detail, examining the document, taking photographs of the business card and the threatening messages. They assured the Walsh family that the investigation would be thorough and that they took the allegations very seriously. As the detectives prepared to leave, the older one, a gray-haired woman named Detective Morrison, paused at the door. I want you to know, she said quietly, that I was a rookie when your father died. I wasn't involved in the original investigation, but I remember it. Even back then, some of us thought the accident ruling was too quick, too convenient. But Aldridge had powerful friends, and the department was under pressure to close the case. She looked at Catherine directly. You did what we should have done 15 years ago. You asked the hard questions and demanded real answers. Thank you for that. After the detectives left, Catherine finally allowed herself to feel something other than fear and determination. She felt exhausted, wrung out by days of tension and adrenaline, but she also felt a profound sense of peace. They had done it. Against impossible odds. Against a billionaire with unlimited resources and powerful connections, they had exposed the truth. Thomas Walsh's murder would be properly investigated. Marcus Aldridge would face justice. And most importantly, her father's legacy would be restored. He would be remembered not as the victim of a workplace accident, but as a brilliant architect whose innovation had been stolen and who had died defending his integrity. The arrest came 3 days after the story broke. Catherine was back at her apartment, finally feeling safe enough to return home. When she saw the breaking news alert on her phone, Marcus Aldridge had been taken into custody by federal agents and charged with patent fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The murder charges were still pending as the district attorney's office built its case, but the fraud charges alone carried a potential sentence of 20 years. Catherine immediately turned on the television and watched as news helicopters captured footage of Aldridge being led from his penthouse in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his face pale and drawn. The mighty billionaire who had seemed untouchable just days ago now looked like what he truly was. A criminal being brought to justice. The perp walk was broadcast on every channel, and Catherine felt a fierce satisfaction watching it. This was the man who had murdered her father and stolen 15 years from her family. This was the man who had threatened her brother, who had tried to bribe them into silence, who had built an empire on lies and violence. Now he was being paraded before the world in handcuffs, his reputation destroyed, his freedom gone, his carefully constructed facade shattered beyond repair. She recorded the footage on her phone and sent it to Thomas and her mother with a single word: justice. But even as Aldridge was being processed and arraigned, new revelations continued to emerge. Rebecca Chun published a follow-up investigation revealing that Aldridge had used his stolen patent money to build a network of shell companies and offshore accounts, hiding assets that prosecutors were now working to freeze. The article detailed how he had systematically stolen from at least 7 other inventors over 2 decades, using the same playbook each time: identify promising work, attempt to force collaboration or licensing, and when that failed, use threats, legal intimidation, or worse, to silence the creator and claim the innovation as his own. One of those other victims came forward publicly after seeing the Metropolitan Post's coverage. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chun, and she had developed a revolutionary water filtration system while working as a graduate student 12 years ago. Aldridge had approached her, offered to fund her research, and then systematically squeezed her out of her own company through predatory contracts and legal maneuvers. By the time she realized what was happening, he owned her patents, and she had nothing. She had tried to fight back but lacked the resources to sustain a legal battle against, quote, Aldridge's team of attorneys. Eventually, she had given up, accepted a small settlement with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, and moved on with her life. But now, seeing what had happened to Thomas Walsh, seeing how the Walsh family had refused to be silenced, Dr. Chun decided her NDA was worth breaking. She provided documentation of Aldridge's theft to federal prosecutors and agreed to testify in any criminal proceedings. Her courage inspired others. Within a week, 4 more victims came forward, each with similar stories of theft and intimidation. The pattern was undeniable, and it transformed the case against Aldridge from a single incident into evidence of systematic criminal enterprise. Catherine watched these developments with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. How many lives had Marcus Aldridge destroyed in his quest for wealth and power? How many brilliant minds had been crushed? How many innovations had been stolen? How many families had suffered? Her father had been just one victim in a decades-long crime spree, but he was the victim whose children had refused to let his death be buried and forgotten, and in seeking justice for him, they had opened the door for all the others. The legal process moved with surprising speed once it began. Federal prosecutors, energized by public outrage and the wealth of evidence, pushed for a trial date within 6 months. Aldridge's lawyers fought for delays, arguing that their client couldn't get a fair trial given the media coverage, but the judge denied most of their motions. The evidence was simply too strong, too well documented, and too damning to allow endless procedural delays. Aldridge was denied bail after prosecutors successfully argued that he was a flight risk with the means and motive to flee the country. He would remain in custody until trial. Catherine testified before a grand jury, recounting her encounter at the Belmont Club and the investigation that had followed. Thomas testified about their father's work and the evidence they had discovered in his files. Laura testified about the final months of her husband's life, the stress he had been under, his determination to expose the theft. And Ronald Martinez, the security guard, provided the most crucial testimony, describing in painful detail what he had witnessed the night Thomas Walsh died, and why he had remained silent for so long. The grand jury returned indictments on all charges, including first-degree murder. The district attorney held a press conference announcing that the state would seek the maximum sentence, arguing that Aldridge had committed a calculated, premeditated killing to protect his financial interests, and had then engaged in a sustained campaign of deception to cover up his crime. The DA, a stern woman in her 50s named Patricia Reeves, spoke directly to the cameras and said something that resonated deeply with Catherine. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It may have taken 15 years, but Thomas Walsh will finally have his day in court, and his killer will answer for what he did. As the trial date approached, Catherine found herself reflecting on how profoundly her life had changed in such a short time. Just weeks ago, she had been a waitress struggling to make ends meet, defined by economic anxiety and the quiet grief she carried for her father. Now she was at the center of one of the biggest criminal cases in the city's history, her name in newspapers, her face on television, her story being discussed by millions of people. It was overwhelming and exhausting, but it was also empowering. She had found her voice and used it to speak truth to power. She had refused to be intimidated or silenced, and in doing so, she had honored her father's memory in the most meaningful way possible. The trial began on a cold morning in January, almost 4 months after Catherine had first recognized her father's signature on that contract. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and protesters holding signs demanding justice for Thomas Walsh and accountability for corporate fraud. Catherine, Thomas, and Laura sat in the front row of the gallery, watching as Marcus Aldridge was led into the courtroom in a suit that no longer fit quite right, his face gaunt from months in custody. He looked diminished, smaller somehow, as though the loss of his wealth and status had physically shrunk him. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They called expert witnesses who testified about the cantilever design, confirming that it was revolutionary and that Thomas Walsh's project journal showed clear evidence of independent development. They called employees from Morrison and Blake who testified about Aldridge's attempts to claim partnership credit and the firm's rejection of those claims. They called the lawyer who had written the threatening letters on Aldridge's behalf, who admitted under oath that his client had instructed him to be aggressive and intimidating in his communications with Walsh. And then they called Ronald Martinez. The elderly security guard, thin and pale from his cancer treatment, walked slowly to the witness stand and was sworn in. For 2 hours, he described that night in painful detail, how Thomas Walsh had arrived for his meeting, how Aldridge had come shortly after, how he had directed Aldridge to the observation deck, how he had heard nothing for 15 minutes, and then suddenly Aldridge was running from the elevator, shouting about an accident, playing the role of horrified witness, how he had seen the scuff marks on the observation deck, evidence of a struggle that had been dismissed too quickly, and how Aldridge had pulled him aside before the police arrived and essentially bribed him into keeping quiet. The defense tried to discredit Martinez, suggesting his memory was faulty after 15 years, that his guilt over not speaking up sooner was causing him to imagine details that hadn't existed, but Martinez was unshakable. He had carried this burden for a decade and a half, and now that he was finally telling the truth, no amount of aggressive cross-examination could shake his testimony. When the defense attorney asked why the jury should believe him now after he had lied to police all those years ago, Martinez looked directly at Aldridge and said, "Because I'm dying, and I don't want to meet my maker with this man's crime on my conscience. I should have told the truth from the beginning. I'm telling it now." The courtroom fell silent after those words. Even the judge seemed moved. Catherine saw several jurors wipe their eyes. It was the kind of testimony that couldn't be manufactured or coached. It was simply the truth, spoken by a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from unburdening his soul. The prosecution rested after 2 weeks of testimony. The defense called their own experts who tried to argue that the patent filing had been a legitimate attempt to protect intellectual property that Aldridge believed he had rights to, that he had been a consulting partner even if the formal documentation was incomplete. They called character witnesses who testified to Aldridge's philanthropy and business acumen, painting him as a visionary entrepreneur rather than a thief and killer. And finally, against his lawyer's advice, Marcus Aldridge took the stand in his own defense. It was a catastrophic mistake. Under direct examination from his own attorney, Aldridge presented himself as the victim of a vindictive family seeking a scapegoat for their grief. He claimed that Thomas Walsh had been unstable and had invited him to the observation deck to discuss their partnership, that Walsh's death had been a tragic accident he had witnessed but not caused. He insisted that his use of signature elements similar to Walsh's was coincidental, that the similarities Catherine had noticed were the result of both men being trained in the same architectural drafting style. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor tore his testimony apart. She confronted him with the timeline showing that he had filed the patent just days after Walsh refused to acknowledge him as a partner. She produced phone records showing dozens of calls from Aldridge's phone to the Walsh family home in the weeks before Thomas's death, the intimidation calls Laura had testified about. She walked him through the threatening letters from his lawyers, forcing him to acknowledge that he had authorized every word. And when he tried to maintain that his presence at the Meridian Tower that night was innocent, she produced security logs showing that he had never before and never after visited the construction site outside of business hours. The coup de grace came when she asked Aldridge to demonstrate his signature. She provided him with a piece of paper and asked him to sign his name several times. Aldridge complied, his hands steady despite the pressure. Then the prosecutor produced documents from 15 years ago, contracts and letters that Aldridge had signed personally before Thomas Walsh's death. The jury could see immediately that his signature had changed. The old signatures were completely different from what he had just written, but documents from after Thomas Walsh's death showed a signature nearly identical to the one Thomas Walsh had used, with all the distinctive flourishes Catherine had recognized at the Belmont Club. "You changed your signature after Thomas Walsh died, didn't you, Mr. Aldridge?" the prosecutor asked. "You literally stole his identity, down to the way he signed his name. Why would an innocent man do that?" Aldridge had no answer. He stammered something about evolving one's signature over time, but it sounded hollow even to his own. The jury's expressions told the whole story. They had seen through him completely. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, the courtroom was so quiet that Catherine could hear her own heartbeat. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, patent fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Each word landed like a hammer blow, and with each one, Catherine felt 15 years of grief and uncertainty finally begin to lift. Marcus Aldridge showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his hands gripped the defense table so tightly that his knuckles went white. The man who had built an empire on stolen innovation and murder had finally been held accountable. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. The judge, a distinguished man in his 70s who had presided over the trial with stern fairness, delivered a statement that would be quoted in legal circles for years to come. He spoke directly to Aldridge, who stood before the bench in an orange jumpsuit, all traces of his former grandeur stripped away. "Mr. Aldridge, you have been convicted of one of the most calculated and cold-blooded crimes this court has ever seen. You murdered a brilliant man not in a moment of passion or desperation, but as a business decision. You determined that Thomas Walsh's life was worth less than the money you could make from his work, and you acted on that determination without hesitation or remorse. Then you spent 15 years profiting from your crime while his family suffered in poverty and grief." The judge paused, letting his words sink in. "The patent you stole generated over $500 million in licensing fees. But that number, staggering as it is, doesn't capture the true scope of your theft. You stole Thomas Walsh's legacy, his children's father, his wife's husband. You stole the innovations he might have created had he lived. You stole the students he might have mentored, the buildings he might have designed, the contributions he might have made to his field and his community. The monetary value of your crime is incalculable because you didn't just steal intellectual property. You stole a human life and all the potential it contained." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as the judge spoke. These were the words she had needed to hear, the acknowledgement that her father's life had mattered, that his murder was not just a crime of property but a crime against humanity itself. Beside her, Thomas gripped her hand tightly, and on her other side, Laura wept quietly, finally hearing her husband's worth articulated by someone with the authority to make it official. The judge sentenced Marcus Aldridge to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction, with additional consecutive sentences for the fraud and conspiracy charges. Aldridge would die in prison. There would be no early release, no pardon, no comfortable white-collar facility. He would spend what remained of his life behind bars, stripped of his wealth and status, remembered not as a brilliant entrepreneur, but as a murderer and thief. As he was led from the courtroom for the final time, Aldridge made the mistake of looking back at the Walsh family. Catherine met his eyes and saw not the powerful billionaire who had once intimidated her, but a broken man who had destroyed his own life through greed and violence. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only a profound sense of justice finally achieved. The civil proceedings that followed were almost anticlimactic after the criminal trial. The Patent Office formally revoked Aldridge's patent and posthumously awarded it to Thomas Walsh's estate. Every company that had licensed the cantilever design was required to renegotiate their agreements with the Walsh family, resulting in settlement payments that totaled over $300 million. It was more money than Catherine could have imagined in her years as a waitress. More than enough to ensure that her mother would live in comfort, that Thomas could continue his education without debt, and that Catherine herself would never have to worry about financial security again. But money had never been the point. What mattered was that her father's name would now appear on the patent, that his innovation would be credited to him in perpetuity, that anyone who used the cantilever system in a building would know it had been designed by Thomas Walsh, not by the man who murdered. The architectural community moved quickly to honor Walsh's memory. Morrison and Blake established the Thomas Walsh Innovation Award, given annually to an architect who demonstrated exceptional creativity and ethical leadership. The Meridian Tower, the building where Walsh had died, installed a plaque in the observation deck commemorating his contribution to its design and acknowledging the injustice of his death. Catherine stood on that observation deck 6 months after Aldridge's sentencing, looking out over the city her father had helped shape. The space had been completed exactly as he had designed it, a breathtaking cantilever extending over the street, giving visitors the sensation of floating above the urban landscape. It was beautiful and terrifying and represented everything her father had believed about architecture, that buildings should inspire wonder, challenge perception, and stand as testaments to human ingenuity. Thomas stood beside her, having just graduated with his engineering degree, and accepted a position at Morrison and Blake, following in their father's footsteps. Laura was there too, looking healthier and more peaceful than Catherine had seen her in 15 years. The weight of unresolved grief had lifted, replaced by the bittersweet satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. They had brought flowers, white roses that had been Thomas Walsh's favorite, and they placed them on the observation deck railing in silent tribute. As Catherine stood there, she thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A single observation in a restaurant, a signature recognized in a signet of clarity, had set everything in motion. She could have kept quiet that night. She could have served Aldridge his coffee, collected her tip, and never mentioned the signature. It would have been safer, easier, less disruptive to her life, but she had chosen to speak up, and that choice had changed everything. The story of how a waitress brought down a billionaire had captured public imagination and inspired others to challenge powerful institutions and demand accountability. Catherine had been invited to speak at universities and conferences, sharing her experience and encouraging others to trust their instincts and speak truth even when it seemed futile. She had discovered a talent for advocacy and had used some of her settlement money to establish a foundation that provided legal support to inventors and creators fighting intellectual property theft. The foundation was named after her father, and its mission was to ensure that other Thomas Walshes wouldn't face such battles alone. Rebecca Chun had won another Pulitzer for her investigation, but she always credited Catherine with the real courage, with taking the first step that made everything else possible. They had become friends in the aftermath of the trial, and Chun continued to investigate cases of corporate fraud and corruption, using the Walsh case as proof that even the most powerful people could be held accountable if journalists and citizens refused to look away. As for the Belmont Club, Catherine never returned. The establishment had reached out after the trial, offering her old job back with a substantial raise and an apology for how she had been treated. But Catherine had moved beyond that world. She no longer needed to be invisible, to serve the wealthy while suppressing her own voice and dignity. She had found something more valuable than financial security. She had found purpose, meaning, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that she had made a difference. Marcel, the mater d' who had fired her, sent a personal letter of apology months after the trial. He admitted that he had known something was wrong that night, but had chosen loyalty to a powerful patron over basic human decency. He couldn't undo his failure, but he wanted her to know that he recognized it and would carry the shame of it. Catherine appreciated the honesty, but didn't respond. Some relationships, once broken, couldn't be repaired, and she was at peace with that. The broader impact of the case extended beyond criminal justice. Several states passed laws strengthening protections for inventors and whistleblowers, making it easier to challenge intellectual property theft and harder for powerful entities to intimidate critics into silence. The case became a standard example in law school ethics courses. illustrating the importance of thorough investigation and the dangers of allowing wealth and status to influence the pursuit of justice. Thomas Walsh's death had been a tragedy, but his vindication had created ripples of positive change that would protect future innovators and creators. On the first anniversary of the Metropolitan Post story breaking, Catherine returned to the diner where she had once worked with her father's project journal in hand. She sat in a booth, the same kind of booth where she had served Marcus Aldridge that fateful night, and she read through her father's notes and sketches. His handwriting was familiar and beloved, each careful line a reminder of his meticulous nature and brilliant mind. She could see his thought process in these pages, the way he had worked through problems, tested solutions, refined concepts until they were perfect. A young server approached to take her order, and Catherine recognized something of herself in the woman's tired eyes and professional smile. She left a generous tip with her coffee and included a note: "Never stop asking questions. Trust your instincts. Speak up when something is wrong. Your voice matters more than you know." The server read the note and looked up, recognition dawning on her face as she realized who Catherine was. "Thank you," she said simply, clutching the note like a talisman. That evening, Catherine visited her father's grave for the first time since the trial. The headstone had been replaced with a new one, paid for by the architectural community, that listed his achievements and innovations. Thomas Joseph Walsh, it read, visionary architect, devoted husband and father. His integrity was worth more than his life. Below that was a small engraving of the cantilever system he had designed, a permanent reminder of his contribution to the field he had loved. Catherine knelt beside the grave and finally allowed herself to speak the words she had been holding for months. "We did it, Dad. We finished what you started. Everyone knows the truth now. Your name is cleared, your work is credited to you, and the man who killed you is in prison for the rest of his life. I hope wherever you are, you know that you were right to fight for what was true, even though it cost you everything. You taught me that integrity matters more than safety, that truth is worth pursuing no matter how powerful the people trying to hide it. I'm going to spend the rest of my life living by those principles, honoring your memory by being the kind of person you raised me to be." The sun was setting as Catherine walked back to her car, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She thought about everything that had changed, everything that had been lost, and everything that had been gained. Her father was still gone, and no amount of justice could bring him back. But his legacy was secure, his reputation restored, and his death had not been in vain. The truth had finally come to light, and that truth had set them all free from 15 years of doubt and unanswered questions. Catherine drove home through the city, past the Meridian Tower standing tall against the darkening sky, past the Metropolitan Post building where Rebecca Chun was probably working on another investigation, past the modest apartment where her mother now lived in comfort and peace. She thought about the signature she had recognized in that moment at the Belmont Club, how a simple observation had unraveled a decade of lies and brought a murderer to justice. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage created the largest ripples of change. Sometimes refusing to stay silent when everyone expected you to was the most powerful thing you could do. And sometimes, she thought as she pulled into her parking space and looked up at her apartment building, justice took 15 years to arrive but was no less meaningful for the wait. Her father had died defending his integrity in his work. She had lived to see that integrity vindicated and that work properly credited. In the end, truth had proven more powerful than wealth, and courage had proven more valuable than comfort. It was a lesson Catherine would carry with her for the rest of her life, a gift from her father that no one could ever steal.